What happens after you rescue or maintain your starter? How do you transform active starter into structured sourdough dough? And what's the secret to those beautiful stretch and folds that build strength without kneading? Hi, I'm Evie, and welcome to part two of my From Starter to Slice series. In part one, I rescued a neglected starter from the back of my fridge that I named Phoenix, and she is still building strength. So today, we're using a different starter. Today, we're diving into the heart of sourdough, mixing dough, building gluten strength, and shaping a loaf that's ready for the oven. Let's get started. This is Gloria. After feeding, she doubled in size before I put her in the refrigerator where she went dormant, but she still has all of these beautiful bubbles throughout. Here's an important note. Refrigerated starter can look active and ready. See all these bubbles? But she's been sleeping in the cold, and cold fermentation slows everything way down. Ideally, I'd let her warm up to room temperature for about an hour or two before using her, but today I'm using her almost straight from the fridge. Will it work? Yes, but it might slow down my bulk fermentation slightly. This is a teaching moment. We'll explore more in a future video, the differences between using cold, room temperature, and warm starter. Each has their pros and cons. But for now, cold Gloria is going to help us make beautiful bread. Now let's mix the dough. I'm making a simple sourdough loaf today with these ingredients: 125 grams of Gloria, 325 grams of filtered water, 500 grams of organic flour, and 8 grams of sea salt. First, 125 grams of Gloria goes into the bowl. Then I'll add 325 grams of filtered water. I'm using a spatula to break up the starter and distribute it evenly throughout the water. You see how it gets kind of milky and smooth looking, kind of like a watered down milk. We're creating a starter water mixture that will coat every bit of the flour, which I'll add now. I'm going to add 500 grams of flour. I'm using an organic all-purpose flour with 11.5% protein that I purchased from Costco, but you can use whatever flour you have on hand. It can be an all-purpose flour, it can be a bread flour. Either way, it'll make great bread. Next, I'm sprinkling in 8 grams of sea salt on top, and then I'll begin mixing these four ingredients into a shaggy dough using a spatula. This is how I'm going to work on getting most of that flour incorporated. Then I'll use my dough scraper to mix in flour from the sides and bottom of the bowl. Finally, I'm going in with my hands to make sure there are no clumps of dry flour. And the dough scraper comes in really handy again for scraping down the sides and also removing most of the sticky dough from my hands. It looks rough and uneven, which is what we expect at this point, because we're not kneading or trying to make it smooth yet. I'm covering the bowl with a plastic cap, and I'm using a marker to note when I mixed the dough. I'll also note when I do the stretches and folds. This dough will rest for about 30 minutes before I begin stretching and folding it. I have a bowl of filtered water that I use to rinse dough off of my hands after the initial mix, and I'll use this same bowl to wet my hands before and after each stretch and fold. Within the next couple of hours, I'll perform stretches and folds every 30 minutes or so. This builds gluten strength without traditional kneading. As you can see, in order to do the stretch and folds, I make sure to wet my fingers and then I lift up a portion of the dough from underneath. I rotate the bowl about 90 degrees and I repeat that process again. I just lift the dough up and fold it over onto itself. For this very first stretch and fold, the dough is expected to be a bit sticky, so don't be surprised by that. It's still just building its initial structure. But as we continue to perform these stretches and folds, you'll see that the dough will become noticeably stronger and you'll see elasticity develop as well as a smoothness and strength that tells us that the dough is ready for the bulk fermentation step. Now that I've completed this first stretch and fold, I'm again rinsing my hand in the same filtered water, which of course is now a little cloudy because of the dough that's in there, but again, it's all going to the same place, so it's perfectly fine. Next, I'm going to cover the bowl with the same plastic cap, and I'll leave it for 30 minutes to bulk ferment. And after 30 minutes, I'll come back and do the second round of stretches and folds. But before that, I'm going to note the time that I completed the first stretch and fold. As you can see here, I waited about almost an hour after the initial mix to do that. Now here we are ready to do the second stretch and fold, and you can see that the dough is already starting to look a little glossier. It's also a bit smoother. It's clearly stronger and has more elasticity to it as I pull it up from the bowl. You can see it's also starting to form more of like a dough ball as I perform each stretch and fold. So this is a really great sign that the gluten is developing in our dough. It's also a lot less sticky than it was when I did the very first stretch and fold. You can see a lot less of the dough is sticking to my fingers after that second set of stretches and folds. Once again, I'll rinse my hands off in the filtered water, and then I will note the time that I completed this second stretch and fold. Here we are at the final stretch and fold that I'll perform for this dough. Again, you can see how it's even stronger. The elasticity is even more apparent. You can even see some bubbles that are starting to form in this dough. After I complete this final stretch and fold, I will once again rinse my hands in that same bowl of water. A quick note, I use the same bowl of filtered water to wet my hands before each stretch and fold, and to rinse off my hands after each stretch and fold, as I mentioned earlier. But it's important to know that when you're done with the water, you do not want to pour it down your sink because it can clog your sink very quickly and cause a lot of damage. So, if you want to know some of the safest ways to dispose of that water without clogging your sink, let me know in the comments. All right, so I'm going to cover that up once again. And this time, I decided to note the time of the stretch and fold before washing my hands, which is why my hand looks so strange there. After rinsing my hands one more time, it is now time for the dough to go through the bulk fermentation process. During bulk fermentation, wild yeast eats the sugars in the flour, which then produces carbon dioxide gas, which then helps make the dough rise during the baking process. The lactic acid bacteria create that signature tangy flavor in the sourdough, and then the dough also becomes airy and jiggly. We know that bulk fermentation is complete when the dough has increased about 50 to 75% in volume. The surface is domed and smooth. You can see bubbles along the edges of the dough, and it jiggles when you move the bowl. There are a number of other tests that can also be done, such as the aliquot method or what people refer to as the window pane test. I'm not covering those in this video, but if you have an interest in learning about some of those other signs that bulk fermentation is complete, let me know in the comments. Almost 4 hours after mixing the dough, I went ahead and did a brief check of the dough, as you just saw, and you could see that the dough was still quite sticky. But here I'm just noting that I checked it about 3¾ of an hour after I mixed the dough. 2 hours later, I checked the dough again, and it is ready for shaping. Shaping the dough is a two-step process. We'll start with pre-shaping the dough. First, I'll sprinkle some of this brown rice flour onto my working surface to keep the dough from sticking. And then I will gently have this dough fall out of my bowl. As you can see, it is slowly sliding down. And another indicator that I like to pay attention to to know that the bulk fermentation is complete is that as the dough is falling out of the bowl, it's literally like sliding out as if I had oiled the bowl beforehand, which I did not. It's simply sliding out because all of that dough, all of that gluten has formed the appropriate structure and strength that it needs to just form into a single dough ball, which is what we're going to create here in just a moment. Now, when it comes to pre-shaping the dough, I'll confess I don't have a real rhyme or reason to this. My real goal here is to just sort of join all of the ends towards the center of the dough and roll it up into a shape that I can then push and pull towards me into a round shape. So that's what I'm doing here. I'm pushing and pulling back the dough. I'm using my fingers to tuck in the dough towards the bottom. And I'm just repeating that process until I have a round bowl. Once I'm done creating enough surface tension on the dough, then the next step is to simply leave it there on my work surface, or the workbench as some may refer to it, and let the dough bench rest. I like to sprinkle a little bit of the brown rice flour on top of the dough so that when I invert it for the final shaping, it does not stick to the surface. Now during the bench rest, this is when I like to prepare my banneton or bowl or whatever vessel you're using that holds the dough shape during the final fermentation. Here I'm using a linen cloth to line a bowl, and I'm sprinkling brown rice flour along the bottom to keep the dough from sticking. During the bench rest, which I prefer to do for about 10 to 15 minutes, it's basically allowing the gluten to relax so that the final shaping is a lot easier. As you can see here, if you look closely, you can see that the dough is slightly relaxing in this time lapse. And then after, I like to poke my dough and just make sure it's still not sticking. And when I poke the dough, it kind of bounces back, not very quickly, but at a moderate rate. If you were to poke the dough and the indentation stays there, then you know that it is over fermented. So now we're going to final shape the dough. I'm using my dough scraper to lift up the dough and invert it so that the floured side is down. I'm gently using my hands to spread out the dough so that I can now do the final shaping. Since this is going to be a bowl or round shape, I am going to take the bottom third, fold it upwards, take the sides and fold them in as you see me doing here. And then I'm going to take that top, kind of like the top of an envelope, and fold it over before I take either side of the dough and fold it towards the center. There are multiple ways that you can final shape your dough, and it's really up to you what you prefer to do. This is just one of the ways that I like to do it. And once again, because this is going to be a round shaped dough, I am moving the dough in a circular motion, pushing it away from me and then pulling it towards me using my fingertips to create the appropriate surface tension on the surface of the dough. Again, using my dough scraper to lift it off of the counter. And here I'm stitching the dough, where I'm basically grabbing the dough on either side of the where I joined it together. This is the bottom of the dough, by the way. We're basically creating a seam so that while it is cold fermenting in the fridge, and then later on when it's placed in the oven to bake, there will be a closed seam on the bottom of the bread. Now I'm bringing in the edges of the linen cloth to cover the dough, and I'm going to just place this lid on top of the bowl before placing it in my refrigerator for cold proofing. Cold proofing does two things. It develops deeper flavor and it makes the dough firm and easy to score before baking. And that's it. Our dough is mixed, shaped, and almost ready for baking. You'll see this loaf baked in an upcoming YouTube short, but in part 3 of this video series, I'll be baking a different loaf, a beautiful multi-seed sourdough I prepared a couple of days ago. Making sourdough requires commitment to the process, to the timing, to the careful work of building structure. We commit our hands to the work and trust that the fermentation will do its part. We do our part with intention and care. Then we wait and trust the process. If you're ready to start your sourdough journey with confidence, my Sourdough Starter Success Bundle gives you everything you need. For just $3, you will get a 7-day starter success checklist, a complete troubleshooting guide, and 3 delicious discard muffin recipes. You can get it at risenourishconnect.com/sourdough starter bundle. The link is in the description and pinned to the first comment of this video. Whether you're a complete beginner or you've tried and struggled before, this bundle sets you up for success. Don't miss part 3. It's the grand finale. Subscribe to the channel or click the link to the video series in the end screen to make sure you don't miss it. We've fed, we've mixed, and next we bake. See you in part 3. Rise, nourish, connect.